So with negative feedback, okay, we know we're going to look at how, okay, by explaining the mechanism behind negative feedback, we will have to talk about how the presence of any deviations from the set point will be detected by certain receptor cells, which will trigger a very specific response. So in the case of osmoregulation here, okay, the hormone that will be controlling the process is called the antidiuretic hormone. Okay, the antidiuretic hormone, okay, gets its name because it stops dilute urine from being produced. So we say essential right there, stop dilute urine being produced. Meaning, so if you have antidiuretic hormone released, the urine will be more concentrated. Why? Because antidiuretic hormone will induce a response whereby it will cause more reabsorption of water. It will stimulate more reabsorption of water, which makes the urine to become more concentrated. Because diuretic comes from the word diuresis, which means the production of dilute urine. So anti-production of dilute urine, meaning making urine more concentrated. Now, this ADH is produced and released by the posterior pituitary gland, which is this one, okay? The posterior pituitary gland, right? The osmoreceptors that will detect the changes in the water potential in the blood is in the hypothalamus here. So this is the hypothalamus. So this is your brain. In your brain, you have the hypothalamus here. Right? So this hypothalamus will have the osmoreceptors, receptors that will detect any changes in water potential in your blood. When it detects that, it will send or trigger or send some neural responses, right? And then which will then stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to secrete or release ADH or antidiuretic hormones. So I'm gonna please remember that. So I'm just gonna add on this posterior. Posterior means di belakang at the back. All right. So when the ADH is released by the posterior pituitary gland, it will make the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to be more permeable to water. So when they're more permeable to water, it allows more water to be absorbed. All right. So in general, when we're describing the mode of actions for hormones, we're going to look at cell signaling here. Okay, it will need, so for example, if you have the hormone, okay, that release hormone will bind to a receptor, okay, any receptor cells, and then it will then send a series of messengers, so that it will start a series of reactions. All right. In this case, when we look at ADH, we see that how it will release CAMP, which is cyclic AMP as the second messenger, and then which then causes the activation of very specific aquaporins, which is present on the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, which then will then result in a response where we will see the aquaporins will then bind and fuse with the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, allowing it to increase its permeability. So this is the general way of how hormones normally work. Okay, with any hormones, they will have very specific protein receptors that they will be able to bind to, and then which will stimulate the production of relay molecules. For example, later on we will see it will involve cyclic AMP, which then triggers various responses to the original signal. We'll see how we will see phosphorylation of the aquaporins as well. Okay, so when I'm going to be going through the effects of ADH and how it will help with osmoregulation, I'm going to talk about how it is released when there is a decrease in water potential. Okay, so this is the deviation from the set point. So there is a decrease in water potential, which is detected by a receptor. So by the receptors, which is the osmoreceptors. Where is this osmoreceptors? It is found in the hypothalamus of our brain. So these osmoreceptors will then send nerve impulses along the neurons, okay, which is sent towards the posterior pituitary gland here. So this is the neuron sending the nerve impulses in the posterior pituitary gland, triggering the pituitary gland to start releasing ADH. When that happens, ADH will then move. Okay, it will be released in the blood. It will travel along the blood. Okay, it will start binding onto specific receptor proteins on the cell surface membranes of the collecting duct. All right, so we're going to look at what happens there. So it's basically the cell surface membranes of the collecting duct that will have these specific receptor proteins for ADH. Now, because of that, we'll see it will lead to different production of enzymes, which leads to the release of aquaporins. And then these aquaporins will start to fuse with the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, making the collecting duct more permeable to water. As a result, water will be able to move through the membrane so once water moves through the membrane of collecting duct, it will move towards or into the concentrated area, more concentrated area of the tissue fluid and the blood plasma in the medulla. Okay, because remember when we were looking at what happened in the loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting duct, we saw a series of active transport happening where active transport of solutes occur, okay, which makes the medulla more and more concentrated. So if the medulla is more and more concentrated, that means that it will have lower water potential. Now, because it has lower water potential, water can and then enter and move down its water potential gradient. But in this case, with the release of ADH, it induces even more water to move, okay, to move into the tissue fluid and blood plasma in the medulla. All right, so how do you find it so far?
Okay, Miss.
Okay. All right, Elmira, okay. All right, so moving on. The sequences that happens, all right, once ADH is released by the posterior pituitary gland, it will bind onto the receptor protein, which stimulates the production of cyclic AMP, which is the second messenger. So this cyclic AMP will activate a signaling cascade, which leads to the phosphorylation of aquaporin. So now aquaporin will become activated, which causes the vesicles, which it is contained in, to move towards the luminal membrane of the collecting duct and fuse with it. Okay, this increases the permeability of the membrane of the collecting duct to water, which is also represented by the image in the next slide here. All right. So what do we mean by luminal membrane? So it's the membrane that is much closer to the lumen. All right. So if we say it's the luminal membrane of the collecting duct, that means it's the membrane that's closer to the lumen of the collecting duct. Again, same story here. Okay, we have now the ADH released and circulated in the blood. It is released by the posterior pituitary gland. It will bind onto very specific receptors on the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct. Okay, that triggers a series of enzyme reaction, which causes the aquaporin to be activated and move. So these vesicles will move towards the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, therefore increasing the permeability of the collecting duct to water. So now water from the lumen of collecting duct will pass through these aquaporins and then leave the collecting duct and enters back into the tissue fluid and the blood plasma of the medulla, which has lower water potential. Now there is more and more reabsorption of water. As a result, we will see that urine, okay, will become lower, will have lower in volume and more concentrated. All right. So if you look into details on how these porins look like, this is the zoom diagrams or detailed diagram. You look further into the molecular level of it. So we can see that this is the aquaporin molecule, which is a protein channel. So you can see that water molecule passes through only this protein channel, because without the secretion of ADH, okay, the what do you call this? Collecting duct. Okay, depending on the collecting duct will be less permeable to water. But if there is more ADH, it becomes more permeable to water. Right. So how do you understand that till that point?
Yes, miss.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on in that case. Okay, so when we look at these structures yesterday, we know that there are high concentration of solutes in the medulla, especially in the deeper tissue, deeper parts of the medulla, because there were processes where there is active transport of the sodium and chloride ions in the upper part of the ascending lip of the Pufenli, and there was also countercurrent multiplier occurring where we can see that there's also diffusion of the sodium and chloride ions in the lower part of the ascending lip of Pufenli. And then there were also active transport of sodium ions out of the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting duct, which further reduces the water potential in the medulla, allowing more reabsorption of water. Okay, of course, that is controlled. This process is controlled by the release of ADH. Now, how does it happen? When there is decrease in water potential, ADH is released, so causing collecting duct to be more permeable to water. So water can move through the membrane. So water can move through the membrane and enters the medulla and back into the blood. Okay, so that makes the urine to have lesser or smaller or lower volume, and it becomes more concentrated. Okay, and if you want to talk the opposite, you can just simply, again, if there is higher water potential in the blood, so if you drink a lot of water, okay, your brain knows that you have excess water. It will not release ADH. All right. So collecting duct will become less permeable to water. Less water will be reabsorbed back. So now your urine will have larger volume and becoming more diluted. All right. So again, so this is a diagrammatic representation of demonstrating the permeability of the collecting duct when you have low ADH. This is not permeable to water, all right? But with high concentration of ADH, when there's ADH release, we have a lot of aquaporins in the luminar cell surface membrane of the collecting duct. So we have a lot of aquaporins, a lot of water channels here. So water will move out through those channels into the tissue fluid and the blood plasma in the medulla. Okay, and again, of course, water will move by osmosis because we know that the tissue fluid and the blood plasma in the medulla are more concentrated because it has high concentration of solutes di sana. All right. So again, when you, so this is an example of an essay question of what you might get asked. All right, so if you want to answer this question, because this is also homeostasis, we need to talk about how ADH will be released as a response to something, isn't it? All right, so in this case, when it comes to osmoregulation, ADH will only be released when there is, what happens to the water potential in the blood?
Decreasing water potential in the blood.
Sorry, louder please.
When there is a decrease in water potential in the blood.
Yes, correct. So again, ADH will only be released when the brain detects that there is decrease in the water potential in the blood. So what part of the brain that detects this, that has the osmoreceptors?
Hypothalamus.
The hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will have these osmoreceptor cells which detects these changes or deviation from the set point, which is the decrease in the water potential in the blood. So triggering a response whereby the osmoreceptors will send nerve impulses along its neuron to the which pituitary gland?
Posterior pituitary gland.
Yep, towards the posterior pituitary gland, which stimulates it to release ADH. ADH will bind onto the receptor on which structure? Where will we find the receptor for ADH? Remy, where would the receptor for ADH be found?
On the
Cell surface membrane of which part of the nephron?
which part?
Mhm.
Not sure, Miss.
So it will be on the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct in this case, yeah? All right, so ADH will bind onto the receptors on the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, right? As a result, it will trigger a series of enzyme reaction where it will cause the aquaporins, which is the water protein channels, okay, to move its vesicle. So the vesicle will start to move towards the cell surface membrane of collecting duct, increasing. So once it fuses, so once this vesicle containing these aquaporins fuses with the cell surface membrane of the collecting duct, this will increase the permeability of the collecting duct, allowing for more water to be able to travel through these porins or through these aquaporins back into the medulla. All right, so as a result, urine will become more concentrated and it has lesser volume because water is now reabsorbed back. Okay, so here are the example of the points. My advice to you is, even though you have the mark scheme here, what's important is if you are able to, right, write the sentence, right? So what you should do in your notes, okay, you try and write the sentence yourself, okay, making sure you